The fluorescent lights buzzed above me, harsh and unrelenting, reflecting off the polished floor of the office. My head throbbed, each pulse a drumbeat I couldn't escape. Deadlines loomed like storm clouds, emails piled up faster than I could respond, and my stomach churned with exhaustion. I told myself I could handle it, that I was strong enough, but deep down, I knew I wasn't. And then, without warning, my legs gave out. 1 second I was standing, pretending everything was under control, and the next I was on the floor, the world tilting violently around me. My vision blurred, and the air felt impossibly thick, as if I were trying to breathe underwater. Co-workers shouted, their faces contorted in panic. But their voices sounded distant, as if coming through a tunnel. My body felt heavy, foreign, and utterly unresponsive. Someone called an ambulance. I felt the prick of a needle, the chill of a cold stretcher against my skin, the mechanical rhythm of life, support humming somewhere behind my eyelids. And then the doctor's voices. Calm, professional, precise, cut through the haze. They were trying to reach my parents. They needed them here. My chest tightened. My parents. The people who were supposed to be my anchors in this world. I clung to the hope that they would be here, that they would rush through the hospital doors with worry etched on their faces, that they would hold my hand and tell me everything would be okay. But they didn't come. I don't remember much after that, only the quiet beep of machines, the sterile smell of antiseptic, the cold steel of the hospital bed. And then, the sting of humiliation. Sharp and unexpected, a notification on my phone. My sister had tagged me in a photo on social media. Family day without the drama. It read. It was a picture of them smiling. My parents and my sister, enjoying some outing while I lay fighting for my life. A tube in my arm, and a monitor tracking the fragile rhythm of my heart. My fingers trembled as I stared at the screen. My heart, already fragile, cracked under the weight of their indifference. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the phone across the room. I wanted to curse them for their cruelty, for their betrayal, for making me feel like a burden rather than a child in need of love. But I said nothing. I had no energy left for anger. Not yet. The hours dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Nurses came and went, checking vitals, adjusting machines, offering polite smiles that couldn't reach my eyes. I felt like a ghost, floating in a world that had moved on without me. My colleagues whispered, some offering sympathy, others awkwardly looking away. Unsure what to do with someone who had been so spectacularly abandoned by the people who should have loved them most. I thought about my life, about the endless cycle of work and obligation and loneliness. I remembered birthdays missed, milestones unnoticed, the countless times I had hoped for a simple call. A word of encouragement, a sign that I mattered. And now, in this stark, sterile room, surrounded by strangers who cared more about my blood pressure than my heart, I realized how alone I truly was. A deep, quiet rage began to smolder in me, not loud, not explosive, but steady and insistent. They had left me to collapse alone, had mocked my suffering while pretending life went on without me. And yet here I was, alive. Fragile, yes, but alive. And somewhere in that realization, a seed was planted. A thought that would grow stronger with each passing day they would answer for this. Somehow. For now, all I could do was breathe, weak and trembling, listening to the rhythm of my own heartbeat against the beeping machines. They thought I was powerless. They thought my suffering would be my silence. But they were wrong. And one day, they would understand that. The days blurred together in the sterile white of the hospital room. Machines beeped rhythmically, a constant reminder of my fragile state, and the antiseptic scent lingered in my nose like an unwelcome companion. I was weak, bones brittle, muscles stiff. The simplest movement exhausting. But something had shifted within me. The helplessness that had first gripped me after my collapse was giving way to a cold, simmering awareness. I was still here, and they had abandoned me. It started small, a flicker of curiosity at the buzzing of my phone. At first, I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see the digital echo of my family's indifference. But eventually, the temptation was too strong. My fingers, thin and trembling, reached for the device. And there it was, 74 missed calls. 74. From my father. My chest tightened as I stared at the screen, the numbers swimming before my eyes. 70. 4 calls he hadn't bothered to make when I was at my weakest, when I needed him most. And then, a single text message. "One need you. Answer immediately." I laughed, a dry, hollow sound that startled even me. Answer immediately. After leaving me to collapse alone. After letting my sister post that mocking photo. The audacity. The sheer nerve. My heart, still weak and tentative, beat faster, not from fear, but from a rising sense of clarity. I didn't reply. I couldn't, not yet. Not until I understood what I wanted. The nurses fussed around me, unaware of the storm building beneath my fragile exterior. They adjusted my IVs, checked my vitals, asked me how I felt, and I smiled faintly, a mask of fragile compliance. Inside, however, I was planning. Each beep of the heart monitor seemed to echo in time with my thoughts. A metronome for plotting something much larger than myself. I replayed the betrayal over and over. My parents' absence, my sister's cruelty. It was all etched into my memory. Sharper than any scar. And yet, amidst the anger, a strange sense of calm began to settle over me. I wasn't powerless. I had survived the collapse. I had survived their abandonment. I could survive whatever came next. And I could, no, I would, turn their neglect into something they couldn't ignore. Recovery was slow, painstaking. I learned to lift my arms, to sit upright, to breathe without dizziness. Each small victory was a reminder that I was not as fragile as they believed. My body, though weak, obeyed my will, and my mind, though battered by betrayal, sharpened with focus. I began to think strategically. I didn't want revenge born of violence or malice. I wanted it to be precise, unforgettable, and sweet in its inevitability. Every missed call, every mocking post, every day they had ignored me became fuel. I cataloged them silently, storing each slight like a ledger of their failures. The phone, the same device that had delivered their cruelty, would become my instrument. I would answer them, but not in the way they expected. I allowed myself brief moments of fantasy. A confrontation where their guilt became undeniable. A reckoning that left them stunned and remorseful. A moment where I could finally reclaim the dignity they had stripped from me. And with each imagined scene, the seed of actual strategy began to sprout. I would bide my time. I would gather strength. I would recover fully, not just to walk again, but to rise with the authority and clarity they would never anticipate. In the quiet of the hospital room, I realized something essential. I didn't need them to survive. I had been abandoned, yes. But in that abandonment, I discovered a terrifying, exhilarating truth. I was my own strength, my own salvation, and in the same breath, I understood that their calls and texts now held no power over me, not yet. I stared at the phone again, the device heavy in my hand, and smiled faintly. Soon, very soon, I would answer. But I would do so on my terms, with a plan they could not see coming. The waiting was excruciating, but I had learned patience. I had learned to endure. And I had learned to plot. The storm inside me had shifted. I was no longer just weak, abandoned, and forgotten. I was awake. And the world, and my family, would remember me for it. By the time I was discharged from the hospital, I was no longer the same person who had collapsed on that cold office floor. My body had regained strength, but more importantly, my mind had sharpened like a blade honed for precision. I walked with a steadiness that surprised even me, each step a declaration of the life I would reclaim. On my terms. The first days at home were delicate. My phone sat on the kitchen counter, silent and deceptively innocent, as if it hadn't betrayed me before. And yet, I knew it would serve as the instrument of my plan. I did not rush to respond to my father's insistent messages. I allowed the suspense to grow, to make them squirm in a way they had made me feel when I lay helpless in the hospital. The power dynamic had shifted. I began to reach out to the people who had truly mattered while my family had abandoned me. Colleagues who had shown genuine concern, friends who had checked in quietly, even neighbors who had dropped off meals unasked. Each contact reminded me that the world was larger than my toxic family. I built a network of support, quietly reclaiming my life from the margins where they had left me. And then I struck. Not with anger, but with calculated clarity. I started small, a subtle reminder of my capabilities and worth. A financial maneuver here, a professional triumph there. My father had invested in a business venture, one he considered his domain, and I made sure my contributions, through insight, strategy, and the quiet exertion of influence, were recognized publicly. My sister, ever boastful on social media, was blindsided when friends and followers began asking about my involvement in projects she had always claimed as her own. The humiliation was gentle, precise, and infinitely satisfying. Yet I did not stop there. I collected pieces of truth, little secrets long ignored or buried. The same sister who had tagged me in that cruel photo had vulnerabilities, financial entanglements, and ambitions she thought hidden. I let these details surface subtly, carefully, orchestrating moments where their absence of empathy collided with their own exposure. Each revelation was like a carefully placed domino, collapsing one facet of their superiority, one assumption of invulnerability at a time. The final act was the sweetest. My father, who had called 74 times while I lay fighting for my life, finally begged for my presence in person. He expected reconciliation, tears, perhaps a quiet forgiveness. Instead, I walked into his study with calm confidence, carrying nothing but the weight of my restored dignity. I listened as he attempted excuses, as he tried to explain away his neglect, but I merely smiled. My words were few, but they cut deeper than any scream. I was not there for him. I was there to claim my place, not in his life, not in his narrative, but in the reality I had built without his care. My sister's expression, when she realized that the family dynamic had shifted irrevocably, was priceless. No photo, no post, no mocking caption could erase the quiet authority I now carried. She had thought she could define me, diminish me, but I had outgrown her cruelty. She saw it in the small ways I moved through the room, the respect others now showed me, and the undeniable truth that I no longer needed their validation. The beauty of revenge, I realized, was not in shouting, nor in dramatic confrontations. It was in subtlety, in reclaiming control, in quietly dismantling the illusion of their power over me, while building a life they could not touch. I had turned their abandonment into my advantage, their cruelty into motivation, and their indifference into a stage for my resurgence. By the end of that week, the balance had shifted entirely. My family, the ones who had ignored my pain, were forced to witness my ascent. They could no longer mock, no longer dominate, and no longer dismiss me. I had survived their betrayal, and in surviving, I had gained more than revenge. I had gained clarity, independence, and an unshakable sense of self-worth. As I stood alone in my apartment that evening, phone silenced, bills paid, work thriving, and friendships solidified, I smiled quietly. I had answered, but not to their calls. I had answered life, my pain, and my own potential. And that, I realized, was the sweetest revenge of all. The first morning after my final confrontation with my family, I woke to the sunlight spilling across my apartment floor. It was warm and indifferent, a reminder that the world moved forward, with or without their approval. I stretched, feeling muscles I hadn't trusted in months, and for the first time in a long time, I felt unburdened. The weight of betrayal and abandonment had been heavy, but now it felt distant, like a storm that had passed. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the city awaken. People bustled about, each wrapped in their lives, unaware of mine. Or perhaps unaware that I had finally claimed it. I realized that freedom wasn't just physical, it was a state of mind. It was waking without dread, without expectation, without the subtle poison of familial manipulation. I was free because I had chosen to be, and because I had survived not only their neglect but the silent, creeping despair that comes with being invisible to the people who should matter most. The phone that had once been a symbol of betrayal no longer intimidated me. Messages still came, but now I read them with amusement rather than anxiety. My father's apologies were earnest but empty, my sister's texts filled with thinly veiled jealousy. I didn't need to answer them, not because I was spiteful, but because I had already answered in the most profound way possible, by living fully, unapologetically, and without dependence on their recognition. I began to rebuild my life on my own terms. Work, once a source of exhaustion and collapse, became a field of triumph. Friends and colleagues, once peripheral in the shadow of my family's indifference, became pillars of support. I learned to trust slowly, to lean on those who had proven themselves, and to celebrate my successes quietly but proudly. Each achievement was a reminder that I no longer required permission to exist, to thrive, to be seen. Healing, I discovered, was more than recovery from physical weakness. It was reclaiming emotional and psychological space. I journaled each night, writing out the betrayals, the frustrations, and the small victories. Until the pain lost its sharp edge, I allowed myself to feel, without judgment, without the shadow of guilt or shame imposed by those who should have loved me unconditionally. And slowly, I found joy again, not the shallow kind I had pretended at for social appearances, but the deep, resonant kind that comes from knowing you are whole despite being broken. One afternoon, I walked through a park near my apartment, watching families play and friends laugh. A pang of memory struck me. My family, absent on the days that mattered. But it was fleeting. I no longer carried anger in my chest, I carried clarity. I had faced betrayal, confronted it, and transformed it into strength. They had underestimated me, ignored me, even mocked me. But I had risen beyond their reach. And in doing so, I had outgrown the need for their approval entirely. Freedom, I realized, was a quiet revolution. It wasn't in revenge alone, though that had been a necessary chapter. It was in living fully, boldly, and with intention. It was in choosing the people who mattered, the work that fulfilled me, and the life I wanted, rather than the one dictated by absent parents or spiteful siblings. Each decision, each small act of independence, became a declaration: I am here. I am strong. I am whole. That evening, I stood on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker and pulse like distant stars. The memory of collapse, of being abandoned while fighting for life, still lingered, but it no longer controlled me. I had answered their calls in my own way, reclaimed my dignity, and discovered a power I had never imagined. The weight of their betrayal had been transformed into wings, lifting me above the shadow they tried to cast over my life. For the first time in years, I smiled without restraint. The storm had passed, and I had emerged not just intact, but triumphant. My family's absence had taught me an invaluable truth: love is not owed, respect is not guaranteed, and strength comes from within. I was free, and in that freedom, I finally understood the sweetest part of all: I no longer needed them to define me. I had defined myself.